Now, I rise tonight to talk about an important trip that I did recently. It comes off the back of what we've seen in the last few years, which is WA Labor spreading a dangerous lie as they have tried to justify new gas expansion and rising emissions in this state, claiming that Western Australia's LNG exports are decarbonising Asia, that they're helping to reduce emissions and good for our climate. Now, obviously, everyone who knows anything about science knows that this is a laughable claim, because to actually decarbonise and to reduce emissions, you need to go from coal to renewables, not onto LNG gas. But Labor has doubled down on this. And last November, we had the Premier in Parliament say that gas is part of the solution, not the problem, and that we need to keep exporting LNG in the region for decades. And he repeated this just last week at the Energy Exchange Expo. In the same breath that he said that he wants Western Australia to be a renewable energy superpower, he said that our LNG exports to Asia need to continue and expand. And that's embarrassing for a government that claims to believe in climate science. And what's been missing from this debate is the voice of Asia's climate experts. What do they think in our region, these experts of WA Labor pushing this misinformation about gas? So during the summer break, I went off on a fact-finding mission. I landed in Tokyo, which is the largest importer of WA's LNG. They take 40% of it. And it is worth noting that Premier Cook visited Japan last July and in September. And when I got hold of his most recent itinerary, I found that on that trip in September, 80% of his meetings were with the Japanese fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel lobby groups. 80%. INPEX, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Tokyo Gas, JERA, that's just to name a few. But as my trip proves, that if you actually go and meet with people who are not working with the fossil fuel industry in Japan, you learn really incredible things. And I had the privilege of meeting with Japan's brightest and best sustainable energy and climate experts. Incredible people doing critical work. And they're devastated by what the WA government is doing. They're distraught that WA Labor is aggressively pushing to increase fossil fuel exports to Japan at this time, in this critical decade when we have to get off fossil fuels. And firstly, something that made them really laugh was when I told them that WA Premier Roger Cook had come back from his visit saying that there was no room for renewables in Japan, that Japan has limited space to deliver onshore and offshore renewables. That's what the Premier told reporters when he got back from his trip last year. Turns out this is a well-known talking point from Japanese fossil fuel companies. That's what they told me. They couldn't believe that our Premier had fallen for it. Also, one of the meetings I had in Tokyo was with the central government there. They run a city for 15 million people incredibly efficiently, and they have a really amazing renewables program. Ambitious, amazing plans for floating offshore wind. So again, that's another lie that I debunked on my trip pretty straight up. But the deeper facts I learnt from these Japanese experts were shocking. It turns out that our LNG exports to Japan are not really about keeping the lights on. What's happening is that the Japanese and Australian governments are carrying out a deliberate policy to aggressively drum up LNG demand across Asia. So both governments spin this claim about how it's all for energy security, but actually they're creating the demand. They're whipping it up. They're trying to sell as much LNG as possible. And they're doing it through this organisation, which sounds nice, called the Asia Zero Emissions Community, AZEC. But actually, this organisation is pushing countries throughout Southeast Asia to expand their fossil gas infrastructure and to import more Australian LNG, much of it from Western Australia. Japan's government is funding this new Asian gas empire through JBIC, which is the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. It's been giving loans to build new gas facilities in countries like Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh and Thailand, funding massive new gas terminals, massive new gas-fired power stations. The Japanese government is also madly trying to import as much Western Australian LNG as they can to on-sell it to countries throughout Asia. They've become the gas dealers of Asia, and we, Western Australia, are the ones feeding this terrible habit. This is about strategic power and control and expanding the profits of these fossil fuel companies, which really have such an incredible level of hold over government policy in Japan. That was very clear from everyone I met with there. It's also worth noting that these Japanese fossil fuel companies made about $680 million in profit on selling uncontracted WA LNG, which is more than this state government received in royalties from the gas industry during the same period, 24-25. So not only are we wrecking the climate, wrecking our region's climate, we're not making any money off it either. The other thing I learnt from these experts in Japan was the details of how the Japanese government is funding gas expansion here in Western Australia, using public money. The Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, lent Woodside $2.9 billion to develop the Scarborough gas field off Exmouth. JBIC lent Waitsia Gas approximately $200 million to develop onshore gas north of Perth. So these terrible new gas projects that so many in our WA community are opposed to, they would not have got up without this Japanese government funding. So the Greens are calling this out. The actions of the Japanese government here in this state pushing fossil fuel expansion must end. I also had the pleasure of visiting South Korea, where I met incredible climate and sustainable energy experts in Seoul. Now, South Korea is the second largest importer of our LNG. And there, I was also shown the evidence of how this flood of LNG into South Korea is displacing renewables. It's holding back the country's transition. It's not helping the climate at all. So there you go, another lie about our gas exports to Asia debunked. And again, in Indonesia, I met with amazing activists in Jakarta, climate and sustainable energy experts. And their critical work is increasingly under threat in Prabowo's Indonesia. It's very dangerous to work for civil society organisations in Indonesia these days. And these experts were horrified to learn that the WA Labor government has singled out Indonesia as a potential new growth export market for our LNG. They want investment in renewables, not for us to dump more gas on them. And they despair that their wealthy neighbour is doubling down on fossil fuels at this time, in this critical decade. And I want to conclude by talking about the heartbreaking visit that I made to the province of Aceh in Indonesia. Last November, record-breaking flooding devastated that province. A rare tropical cyclone brought extreme rainfall that triggered flash floods and deadly landslides, wiping away whole villages overnight. More than 1,170 people were killed and around 1 million people displaced. And I was there just 6 weeks after this event, and it was devastating. I went to a town called Aceh Tembiang, which was one among the area's hardest hit. More than 100 people were killed in that town and the surrounds. Thousands of homes and buildings were severely damaged as a 7-metre-high flash flood tore through that community. Residents were trapped without food and water for days on their roofs. And 2 months on, 90,000 people are still living there in tents and temporary accommodation. And of course, monsoon rains are normal in this part of the world, but what's not normal is the growing intensity of these storms. Indonesia is highly vulnerable to climate change impacts, including extreme events such as floods and droughts. And an analysis of last year's flooding by climate scientists found that ocean temperatures were warmed by human-caused climate change, and that fed that intense rainfall that triggered that 7-metre flash flood, those deadly floods and landslides that killed 1,170 people, our nearest neighbours. So this is the true cost of our LNG exports to Asia. We are supercharging our climate, and it is our nearest neighbours who are paying the price, an increasingly deadly price. And this is what governments who promote and who fund and who support continued fossil fuel expansion are responsible for. When you continue to do that in 2026 in the middle of a climate emergency. So this fact-finding mission has debunked these lies of this government, their Asia gas myth. This is not about decarbonising. We are stopping countries from going from coal to renewables. We are displacing renewables across Asia. And we have two of the wealthiest countries in this region, Australia and Japan, working hand in hand to keep the poorest nations in Asia hooked on fossil fuels. And they're paying the price, and it's deadly. So we're slowing decarbonisation efforts across Southeast Asia. We're crowding out renewables, delaying the transition. And Western Australia is a key part of this morally corrupt plan. I'm so thankful to the incredible people I met on this trip, to every single person in Japan, South Korea and Indonesia. It's incredibly difficult doing this job, particularly in a place like Indonesia, where environmental and climate activists are regularly targeted and often pay with their lives. So it was a privilege to meet with you. Your work is an inspiration. You have the full solidarity of the Greens. And I promise you we will not give up the fight to protect our climate, our kids' future, and this beautiful planet. Thank you, President.